The rain tapped lightly against the windows as the wind howled through the trees outside. Inside the White family's warm and modest home, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Mr. White leaned over the chessboard, studying his next move, while his son, Herbert, grinned with confidence. "You're thinking too hard, Dad," Herbert teased, leaning back in his chair. "I've got you this time." "Nonsense, Mr. White retorted with a chuckle, moving his piece with exaggerated precision. "Checkmate is just around the corner for me." Mrs. White sat nearby, knitting quietly, but listening to the playful banter between father and son. The scene was peaceful, almost idyllic, but an undercurrent of anticipation hung in the air. They were expecting a visitor, an old friend of Mr. White's, whose stories always brought intrigue into their otherwise routine evenings. As the clock struck 8, there was a firm knock at the door. Mrs. White rose to answer, and moments later she ushered in a burly, weathered man with a heavy coat and a face worn by years of travel. "Good evening, Sergeant Major Morris," Mr. White exclaimed, standing to greet him. "It's been far too long." "Indeed it has," Morris replied, his voice deep and gravelly. He shook Mr. White's hand firmly before settling into an armchair near the fire. His gaze swept over the room, taking in its cozy charm. As tea was served, Morris began recounting tales of his travels. His words painted vivid pictures of distant lands, strange customs, and peculiar artifacts. The White family listened with rapt attention, their imaginations carrying them far from their little home. But when Morris paused, his expression grew serious, and he reached into his pocket. The flickering firelight caught something dark and leathery as he withdrew it. "What is that?" Herbert asked, leaning forward in curiosity. Morris hesitated, his voice lowering as he replied, "It's a monkey's paw, a relic from India." "It's no ordinary object, I assure you." The air in the room shifted. The once cheerful atmosphere was now tinged with unease, and the White family exchanged glances. Their quiet evening was about to take an unexpected turn. The room fell silent as Morris held the small, shriveled monkey's paw in his hand. Its grotesque appearance was unsettling, a gnarled shape with fingers frozen mid-curl, as if gripping something unseen. "It's cursed," Morris said gravely, his eyes fixed on the object. "An old fakir enchanted it. He wanted to show that fate rules our lives, and those who interfere do so to their sorrow." Mr. White leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean by enchanted? What does it do?" "It grants 3 wishes," Morris replied. "To each man who owns it." Herbert laughed nervously, breaking the tension. "Sounds like something from a fairy tale. What's the catch?" Morris's face darkened. "The wishes come with consequences, terrible ones. The first owner wished for wealth and died shortly after. The second begged for love but was left alone and broken. It twists your desires into something unrecognizable." The White family exchanged uneasy looks. Mrs. White shifted in her seat, clearly skeptical. "If it's so dangerous, why keep it? Why not destroy it?" "I've tried," Morris admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I threw it into the fire once, but something stopped me. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear." He paused, placing the paw on the table between them. "It's brought me nothing but grief." The fire crackled, filling the silence. Mr. White stared at the paw, his thoughts racing. "Why not get rid of it now?" Morris sighed. "Perhaps I will. But it's not so simple. People are drawn to it despite the warnings. That's why I came here tonight, to pass it on." "But if you take it," he said, fixing Mr. White with a stern gaze, "be careful." Herbert smirked, trying to lighten the mood. "Let me guess, it grants wishes, but only after you pay shipping and handling." "Enough, Herbert," Mrs. White scolded gently, though she couldn't suppress a faint smile. Ignoring his son's joke, Mr. White reached out hesitantly. "May I hold it?" Morris hesitated, then nodded. "But remember, it's not a toy. Treat it with respect, or better yet, don't treat it at all." As the paw changed hands, the room seemed to grow colder. Mr. White held it up to the light, studying its strange form. His wife and son watched, their earlier skepticism replaced by a flicker of unease. Morris stood abruptly. "I should go." He gathered his coat, his expression heavy. "I've done my part. The rest is up to you." The door closed behind him, leaving the White family alone with their thoughts and the monkey's paw. The monkey's paw sat on the table, untouched, as if daring someone to test its power. The firelight played across its twisted shape, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Herbert was the first to break the silence. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what are we going to wish for? A fortune? A castle? Maybe a lifetime supply of chocolate?" Mrs. White rolled her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just an old superstition." Morris must have had too much to drink. Mr. White, however, wasn't so quick to dismiss it. He picked up the paw, feeling its coarse texture in his hand. What if it's not just a superstition? What if it really works? Herbert grinned. "There's only one way to find out. Go on, Dad. Make a wish." Mrs. White sighed. "Oh, for heaven's sake. If it'll put an end to this nonsense, wish for something small, something harmless." Mr. White hesitated, his mind racing with possibilities. Finally, he spoke. "I wish for 200 pounds. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of doubt. The paw twitched in his hand, and he nearly dropped it. Everyone froze, staring at the object as if it might come to life. "Did you see that?" Mr. White whispered, his face pale. "It's probably your imagination," Herbert said, though his grin faltered. "Or maybe the power of suggestion." They waited, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife, but nothing else happened. No flash of light, no clap of thunder, no sudden wealth appearing out of thin air. "See?" Mrs. White said, relieved. "It's just a silly old trinket. Now let's put it away and move on." Herbert laughed, the sound nervous but genuine. "Maybe the money will show up tomorrow, delivered by a leprechaun riding a unicorn." Mr. White placed the paw back on the table, his hands shaking slightly. Perhaps it was a mistake to keep it. The family tried to return to their usual evening routine, but the mood had shifted. The cozy warmth of the room felt heavy, almost oppressive. Each of them, in their own way, wondered if the wish would come true and at what cost. Later that night, as the house fell silent and the fire died down to embers, the paw lay still on the table. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it an air of unease. The morning dawned gray and somber, with a chill in the air that seemed to seep into the walls of the White family's home. Mrs. White busied herself in the kitchen while Herbert prepared to leave for work. Mr. White sat by the window, staring at the monkey's paw on the table. "It was just a silly game," Herbert said, fastening his coat. "Don't brood over it, Dad. I'll see you tonight." He kissed his mother on the cheek and left, whistling as he walked down the path. The door closed, and the house felt unusually quiet. By midday, the quiet turned to unease. Mrs. White glanced at the clock more often than usual, while Mr. White remained lost in thought. Neither spoke of the paw, but it lingered in their minds like a shadow. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension. A man in a dark suit appeared at the door, holding his hat in his hands. His face was solemn, and he hesitated before knocking. Mrs. White answered, her cheerful greeting faltering at the sight of the man's expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "Mrs. White, I'm from Ma and Megan's," he began, his words heavy. "I'm afraid I have some bad news." Mr. White joined them at the door, his heart sinking. The man continued, his voice quiet but clear. "There's been an accident at the factory. Your son, Herbert, he was caught in the machinery. We did all we could, but—" He paused, unable to finish. Mrs. White gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. Mr. White steadied her, his own face ashen. No, that can't be," he whispered. The man looked away, as if to shield himself from their grief. "The company wishes to express its deepest condolences. They've asked me to offer you this as compensation." He handed over an envelope, his hand trembling. Mr. White took it, opening it slowly. Inside was a check for £200. The envelope fell to the floor as Mrs. White let out a wail of anguish. The amount matched the wish perfectly, but the price was unimaginable. Mr. White sank into a chair, staring blankly at the check in his hands. The monkey's paw sat on the table, silent and unmoving, as though mocking them. Its promise had been fulfilled, but at a cost far greater than they could have ever imagined. The days that followed Herbert's death were a blur of grief and silence. The once lively home felt cold and empty, filled only with echoes of what had been. Mr. White spent hours staring into the fireplace, the crackling flames doing little to warm his heart. Mrs. White, pale and hollow-eyed, moved through the house like a ghost. One evening, as the rain tapped on the windows, Mrs. White broke the silence. Her voice, soft and trembling, carried a strange urgency. "We still have 2 wishes left." Mr. White turned to her, his face shadowed with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "The paw," she said, her eyes wide with desperation. "We can wish him back." "We can bring Herbert back to us," Mr. White recoiled, shaking his head. No, we can't. You don't understand. The paw, it doesn't work the way we think. It twists things. You saw what happened." "I don't care," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's Herbert. Our son. What could be worse than losing him? Please, we have to try." Her desperation was unbearable, and Mr. White felt his resolve falter. Against his better judgment, he retrieved the monkey's paw from its place on the table. It felt heavier in his hand, its presence oppressive. He held it up, his voice barely a whisper. I wish for my son to return." The paw jerked in his hand, as if alive, and a sudden chill swept through the room. Mrs. White gasped, her hands clasped tightly together. They sat in silence, waiting, their breaths shallow and hearts pounding. Hours passed. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof. Just as they began to believe nothing would happen, a faint sound echoed through the house. It was a knock. Faint at first, then louder. Mrs. White's head shot up, her eyes bright with hope. "It's him. It's Herbert," she exclaimed, running to the door. "No," Mr. White said, his voice low and panicked. "It can't be. It's not possible." The knocking grew more insistent, filling the house with its steady rhythm. Mrs. White struggled with the locks, her hands trembling. "Help me quickly," she begged. But Mr. White remained frozen, dread pooling in his chest. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't the son they had lost. The knocking grew louder, each strike reverberating through the house like a heartbeat. Mrs. White fumbled with the last lock, her hands trembling with frantic anticipation. "I'm coming, Herbert," she cried, her voice breaking with emotion. "Stop," Mr. White shouted, rushing toward her. He grabbed her arm, his face pale and stricken. "You don't know what's out there. It's our son," she snapped, pulling free. Her eyes were wild with hope and grief, her determination unshakable. But Mr. White knew better. The paw's power was cruel, twisting wishes into nightmares. Whatever stood on the other side of that door wasn't the Herbert they had loved and lost. It was something else entirely. As Mrs. White reached for the handle, Mr. White turned and snatched the monkey's paw from the table. His hand shook as he gripped it tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I wish my son was dead again," he whispered hoarsely. The paw writhed in his grasp, its movement unnatural and sickening. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Mrs. White froze, her hand hovering over the lock. Slowly, she turned to her husband, her face a mask of confusion and despair. What have you done?" she whispered. Mr. White couldn't meet her eyes. He lowered the paw, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his decision pressed down on him. "I had to," he said, his voice barely audible. "It wasn't him, not really." Mrs. White let out a strangled sob and collapsed against the doorframe. The silence outside was absolute, as if the world itself was holding its breath. With trembling hands, Mrs. White unlocked the door and threw it open. The porch was empty. The rain had stopped and the night was still, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. She stepped out into the darkness, looking desperately into the empty street. "Herbert," she called, her voice echoing into the void. But there was no answer. Mr. White stood in the doorway, watching her. The pain in her voice cut through him like a knife, but he knew there was no undoing what had been done. The paw had granted its final wish, and the price had been paid. The two of them stood there, broken and alone, as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon. The monkey's paw lay forgotten on the floor, its power spent, its curse fulfilled. The story of the monkey's paw is not just a thrilling tale, but also an excellent opportunity to learn and explore English phrasal verbs in action. Let's look at some of the phrasal verbs used throughout the story and understand their meanings. Number 1, break down. Meaning, to collapse or stop functioning properly. Example from the story: her heart broke down when she heard the news. Explanation: when someone's emotions break down, it means they are overwhelmed with feelings and can no longer control them. Number 2, bring back. Meaning, to return something to its previous state. Example from the story: we can bring Herbert back to us. Explanation: in the story, the phrase refers to the hope of bringing someone back to life, returning them from the dead. Number 3, come up, meaning to happen or appear unexpectedly. Example from the story: a problem came up that no one expected. Explanation: in the story, things don't always go as planned, and unexpected events arise, like the consequences of making wishes. Number 4, get rid of, meaning to remove or dispose of something. Example from the story: I should get rid of it. Explanation: here, the character wants to get rid of the monkey's paw because of its curse and harmful influence. Number 5, give in, meaning to surrender or agree to something after resisting. Example from the story: he finally gave in to her plea. Explanation: Mr. White initially resists using the monkey's paw for the second wish, but eventually gives in to his wife's emotional plea. Number 6, look after, meaning to take care of something or someone. Example from the story: he promised to look after her during the difficult time. Explanation: this is a common phrasal verb meaning to care for someone or something, as when characters look after each other emotionally after tragedy strikes. Number 7, make up, meaning to create or invent something. Example from the story: he made up the story about the paw. Number 8, settle down, meaning to become calm or start living a more stable life. Example from the story: the family tried to settle down after the events. Explanation: the family tries to return to normal, but the atmosphere is anything but calm due to the strange events surrounding the paw. Number 9, take over, meaning to gain control or dominate. Example from the story: the grief took over her emotions. Explanation: in the story, emotions and fate take over the characters, driving their actions and decisions. Number 10, turn into, meaning to change into something else. Example from the story: the wish turned into a nightmare. Explanation: this phrase shows how something can drastically change, as in how the wish turns from a hopeful moment into a disaster. Remember, every little bit of practice makes a difference. Don't give up. If you enjoyed this story and found the learning experience valuable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories and language tips. See you in the next story to learn even more.